are live. Welcome, everyone. This is Playing in Tactic with George and
Justin, and no Bryson. No Bryson today.
No Bryson.
We have somebody quite possibly better. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see.
I'm at best knockoff Bryson. Tim Medin, thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome, Tim. And you look like you're in a nice little background there. That's not your usual background. Where are you joining us from?
No, I wish it was. I am at the beach, so there's the beach.
There you go.
Run up here real quick. Had to switch from the beers to coffee, and get ready to roll for this. But somehow the sweat isn't me being nervous. It's bloody hot here, and I'm not in the water.
He proved he's not on a green screen. I like that part too. Like normally people are like, "Oh, I'm on a beach," and then he pans to the actual people.
Maybe it's just a really good green screen.
Yeah,
it's just everywhere.
Next level.
With the whole video thing in the background and everything. But cool, man. Thank you for joining us. Anyone that doesn't know Tim Medin, shame on you. I'm just kidding. Tim is awesome. Definitely check him out on Twitter. He's the CEO of Red Siege, and I met Tim 10 plus years ago or something Sands 560. I was coming up as an instructor. We all helped each other. It was nice. It's a whole Sands family thing, you know? Everyone gives everyone feedback. You can critique everyone nicely, but
well, there's the older guys, and we're kind of the newer generation, so we came up like siblings, right? And Ed was like dad, kind of to some degree. It sounds just as creepy as I just made it sound.
Ed was dad for sure. No, but thanks for joining us today in Playing in Tactic. We are going to talk about what happened last weekend, not related to Black Hat or DEF CON, but instead the release of an attacker playbook, in particular, Conti. Conti is currently, I follow, I think it's Dark Matter, one of these Twitter groups that follows the ransomware groups, and they're up there. They're one of the top ones. And apparently, one of the affiliates got angry at them and decided to leak this manual. And this manual, the original leak was in Russian, so people have taken the time to translate that. And we got some time to go through that and take a look at what's happening there. So, Justin, let's go with you first, Meister co-host. What was your first thing when you saw this playbook, other than, oh my gosh, this is a better playbook than we have?
You're right. No, I was impressed, right? So they released a bunch of software as well. So they released they had Cobalt Strike that was cracked, and a bunch of random tools they released as well. So I was shocked that there was such like a titled manual, right, with phases and tiers. And I know that, you know, in years back in pen testing, people were more free form. As you know, these days a lot more people are building things similar to this. But I was actually really impressed by the the thoroughness, and it's all numbered, and there's some basic information that's pretty useful. So the section 1, I think the biggest thing that caught me by surprise at first was that they ripped through a bunch of commands for like using who am I. So the premise behind this manual is it's for using Cobalt Strike once they have a shell in an environment, kind of trying to see what they can do and move laterally. So there's a bunch of commands in here like shell who am I, shell NL test, things like that. And the way Cobalt Strike works is it pushes all that through cmd.exe. So George and I were talking before the show, and you look at this combination of commands like net group or net local group administrators, things like that. Most EDR products will get very upset about this stuff, right? So this kind of speaks to who they're targeting at this point, unless they did something like disable these products. Stringing a bunch of these commands together tends to light things up from an EDR side. So they're obviously going after less mature organizations, which we kind of know is their MO. I know, George, you have more on thoughts on that side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fact that they had the manual, and I do a lot of training as well. Teach for SANS, the Red Team course. A lot of people that are starting with Red Team, and yeah, like you said, it used to be, or sometimes it still is, right? It all depends on what the customer wants, right? I think that should be clear. But some have playbooks, especially when you try to scale up your team. and I was building that team at a large financial. We were scaling up to 12 people, and the playbook books were good, right? Having at least you should try this, you should try that. But yeah, I haven't really seen a playbook like this. A little different for how we do it in SCYTHE. Obviously, we put together adversary emulation plans. So what we do, and kind of where I did the research here, was look at our threat for Conti that we got from the DFIR report. So someone got owned. They did incident response. They then released the CTI report. It has procedures, and then kind of comparing them back and being like, holy crap, you're right. This actually matched quite a bit, which is great for us, right? Because it shows that we built the right things. But also, very interesting commands and kind of the whole playbook. Do these people take any other routes as they go, or are they just copy and pasting and YOLO? Maybe this works, maybe it doesn't. And the fact that it does work, I think, is tough. Let's go over to Tim. Tim, you run a growing red team, right? Do you use playbooks like these? I know you do a lot of pen test work. Is it more free for all? Do you have some basic things that you always want to check for? How are you doing that?
Yeah, so we've got like a shared playbook to some degree. It's not quite organized like this. I think at least for me, the most interesting piece here, actually kind of two things, and it's more of a high level thing. Like there are clearly a process to onboard newer people here, right? And I saw Mubix had a great tweet. He's like, look, 80% of the organizations that I've worked at haven't had playbooks this good, right? And it kind of shows to some degree the structured nature of these organizations. They've got the exact same problems that any business has. How do we get new people up to speed? How can we scale? They quite literally have HR issues, which is why this dude got pissed off and leaked everything, right? Like it's the exact same crap that all of us deal with. Like it's not special. They're not, we sometimes say they're super advanced. We sometimes say they're super dumb. Neither is necessarily true, right? There's some of each, just like any other organization. I found that piece to some degree to be the most fascinating because this gave us a little bit look on the inside on what exactly people are doing on the keyboard. Another thing that I like with this, you may have seen like a red team field manual, which I think is a fine resource, but there's commands, but you don't know what those do. The nice piece here is it's a little bit more distilled, like here's the important things to run, and then out a little bit of a description. Here's exactly what this thing gives you, and you might be able to use that in later steps. That's kind of my first look at this.
Awesome. I actually hadn't considered the whole HR thing, like because they do operate like companies, right? Like they hire pen testers that may or may not they're doing illegal stuff, and they have this onboarding thing, but their HR, I guess, is not good. That's a good.
Well, the whole. I think Brian Krebs sort of turned on the light for me, but the whole process and the ecosystem and the SLAs with ransomware and the whole process, like it's really damn impressive, right? Like if you look at some of this is broader than Conti, but if you look at like the SLAs, like hey, if this thing doesn't work, we'll give you support at this rate to get you into the systems and hide from AV, and it's impressive.
Awesome. So let's kick it off. We posted the link to the translation that we have. So shout out to Silence is Best. The link is there. And we're going to go step by step through some of these, as many as we can in the next like 30 minutes or so. But Justin, take it away.
Yeah.
Number one, what's that first thing? They're doing discovery, I think.
Yeah, basically just figuring out, who they are, what rights they have, where domain controllers are, things like that. I mean, these are pretty standard for, people coming from like a pen test background. This is probably the first step. Going back to the playbook thing, like the downside here with some of this is when people are talking about playbooks and like the red team and whatever side, the pen test side, is like getting people to blindly cut and paste things and not always understand what and why they're doing is kind of like, my issue with this is that's why I said we're trying to move more towards mind maps, or if you encounter this, these are alternate options. Not to go back to that, but that's kind of one of the things we're seeing there. And since we kind of hammered on that already, like the second step here, they're doing some stuff like invoke share finder, so they're importing some PowerShell. Basically looking for overprivileged shares. files that they can, try to hijack. Because, obviously the other part of this is they steal as much as they can and try to potentially, ransom that back, as well as, encrypting systems. So they're just trying to find accounting data, client projects, things like that. I think you'd see most pen testers take a similar approach, right? If they're not using PowerShell Share Finder, they might use something with, Unpacket, loop through shares with whatever basic user rights they have. This is an easy thing to emulate. And this is also a good area for companies to kind of understand, what rights, low-level users have. So for example, it's probably common for, somebody to mess up a permission on an IT share where perhaps there's a bunch of backup files. The backup files might be compressed, but they might contain passwords for something else. So this is kind of, you can walk through these steps in your own environment and kind of see, hey, what would the impact be there? And I know you kind of digged in this a bit with like the replay attacks and stuff like that you do, George, but I mean, breaking this down into actionable items for you to try to attack is probably a good exercise for most companies.
Yeah, for sure. So the everything in 1 and 2 is essentially any user can do this, any permission. The initial exploration, all living off the Beltland, right? Things you can do from a standard command prompt. I saw you post a Sigma rule for when people run Who Am I. Funny enough, we were doing an exercise. This was a purple team exercise. And though the Who Am I was actually caught by an analyst that just created a Splunk rule to email them whenever someone ran Who Am I on a server, which, was a decent thing to do. Like, how often does someone actually run Who Am I on it? So that was a fun little time. This person wasn't even in the SOC anymore, but they had the email still triggering to them. So someone not part of the exercise found it. But yeah, definitely things to look for early on, right? The earlier you catch them, the better. And then you mentioned PowerShell stuff. And then the third one here, I don't think they translated it, right?
Well, hold on. Let me do the second one. I want to touch on the second one. First off, how did you guys, as 12-year-old boys at some point in your history, not laugh about the translation? And we removed the balls in 2 cases. I just giggled. I don't know what that's supposed to mean.
I actually thought about it. I first giggled. Yes.
Did.
And then I think it means roles. Like, you remove certain roles based on if you have right permission or not, or certain targets. I don't know. I don't know.
We're internally, we're just going to start using the word balls for things. Anyway, I think the interesting thing here is one of the things that we see, and this isn't even hyperbole, this is something we see in literally 100% of the internal test or the assumed breach that we see. Excessive information on shares. Steve in marketing, Sally in accounting, whatever, and there's sensitive data on a public share that's overexposed. And it doesn't have to be, the common misconception is it has to be all the data. No, right? I mean, how many records have to be leaked before you're in the news, before you get a GDPR fine, before any of that? You don't want any of those things. And we find this information, like I said, quite literally on 100% of our engagements, there's something out there. The quantity varies, how sensitive it is, it varies, but this is incredibly, incredibly powerful to just simply look as whatever user you have, not an admin of any sort, there's going to be something out there. So anyways, okay.
And carry on. Now you got me talking about it. And it's like the hardest thing to actually fix. Right? It's like you have too much info in your shares. So the sysadmins are like, well, it's a share. I'm not responsible for what goes there. I'm responsible that it's accessible, that the right permissions are set. But if that person has permissions, then they can put it. That's not my problem. Then the DLP people are like, well, the DLP caught it, but we can't really take it out because it's a business thing. So we actually have to go to the owner and find the owner. It's like this people process problem, not even a technology problem at this point. And it's essentially what causes the impact and gets them paid is obviously the harder non-technical things to fix.
And what's funny here, right, is this obviously focuses on Windows shares, right? So once you think you fix this section, the other thing that we always look for is open NFS shares, because those are easier to screw up and they're generally involved with backups and things like that. So if you're working through this and you're saying, hey, we fixed our Windows problems, go back and check for NFS shares, because they're always out there and there's always important IT data just laying around. And that's something that places really struggle with. once they get this lockdown, obviously. Just a little something to look for.
And to that point too, it's beyond, Windows shares. It's whatever fill-in-the-blank CMS you got now. Now SharePoint is the new file share, and good freaking luck getting the permissions on that thing right? Like understanding the hierarchy takes a PhD, and that's, I don't know. I can't even comprehend how you do some of that. At least with the file shares, like I see files, I can right-click, look at permissions. I can with SharePoint or fill in the blank whatever product, things start to get even hairier. Especially when we ask people like, make sure you share things securely, and they don't know what that means. The share is secure, right? Let's put it out there. Let's put it on fill in the blank thing.
SharePoint is another fun thing. Like you mentioned, I've seen examples where they lock down permissions, but they installed a tool that let you preview documents, and somehow the preview tool lets you view the documents you still didn't have rights to. So there's just layers upon layers of potential problems there.
Awesome. And now we get to the incorrect translation, the Tim attack, also known as Kerberos.
Yeah, George, you were going to talk about this one, right?
So yeah, I can't explain Kerberos, but I brought someone that can do it better. They're right there. There you go. Tim, what is this?
Yeah, so I came up with this in 2014. Actually, like 2 years before that, I shipped it. I sold it to DEF CON twice, got turned down twice. Whole separate story. Still a little bit bitter. Whatever. But what the fundamentals here, and I've got a very long presentation on Kerberos, how this all works. redsiege.com/Kerb101. But the short version is the tickets are encrypted using the password hash of the target service. There's multiple pieces. So what I'm going to do is request tickets for these target services, right? It's encrypted, as I mentioned, using the hash of the target service, so I can request these. The interesting piece is the domain controller doesn't decide if I have access to literally any system other than itself. It says, here's a thing that this is who Tim is, and you decide. It's like a driver's license, right? The state of Texas gave me my driver's license. If I want to go into a restaurant, a bar, the club, whatever, the bouncer at the door decides whether Tim is allowed in or not, right? It puts the hologram on there so that the bouncer or whatever can look at it and decide, is Tim allowed in or not? And that's essentially what happens with Kerberos. It takes a look at the driver's license, it checks for the hologram, and that hologram, for all intents and purposes, is based on the password hash of the target service. So I can request a whole bunch of these tickets, guess a password, hash it, attempt to decrypt, do that over and over and over again, and then maybe get credentials for that target service. Now, many times that target service has a lot of permissions, way too many times. Even if it doesn't, there's other things like silver ticket attacks. You might be able to just access that system directly. You might have admin on that system, even if it's not a full domain admin. You typically get some very powerful credentials out of these things. It gives you a lot of reach into the organization, especially to the servers, right, where the data mainly is. So that's the, 3-minute version of Kerberos.
That was awesome. I had never heard that actually. Now you confuse me more. Now I feel I understand Kerberos less. No, I'm just kidding.
I feel like that every time I explain it.
Right? Every time I explain Kerberos, I actually learn a little bit about it. And what's interesting about this is 2014, right? I think it was Sans Hack Fest was the official release. I didn't know the backstory.
I think DerbyCon was, but
was it DerbyCon?
Second.
Okay,
it took 6 months for people to figure out.
What?
No,
I didn't know that.
DEF CON said my code wasn't ready yet. So they wouldn't take the talk. And I was like, really? I'm trying to think the last time I saw a presentation at DEF CON where it wasn't, hey, I was working on the code last night, or I finished up the slides an hour ago, whatever. Anyway.
And the worst thing is you released a new technique. This is a technique in MITRE ATT&CK, which means there's a ton of procedures for this. And right here in number 3, we actually see two different ways of doing it, right? One with invoke Kerberos.ps1. Did you even write that? I don't think that one was yours, right? I think that was the SpectreOps folks that put it in PowerView. And then Rubius, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. I know you've written a lot of them, but like, you presented a brand new technique, which kind of gets you to a point from a defender perspective. Like, yeah, you can detect Kerberos.ps1 on your system, but you probably want to do the detection over on the Active Directory side, right?
And to answer your point, Yasser, this is more closely tied with the silver ticket because passwords for target surface accounts might be crackable. KRB, TGT, for all intents and purposes, you're not going to guess it. It's randomly generated. So just to answer that question, in a weird way, because I just dropped this thing at DerbyCon, and it took a while, quite literally, for people to figure out what the hell was going on, because I didn't know how to explain it. I literally got like rejections from conferences, like, this doesn't make any sense. Because it was weird, right? Like, how can you attack services that you don't actually talk to? Like, that doesn't even, conceptually, it doesn't make sense. And it quite literally took 6 or 8 months before, it was a couple of the guys at Varus, I think, were some of the first ones who were like, oh, I think I see what we got here. And they kind of started running with it and frankly created better tools than I could because I'm not a great programmer. And then, the bad guys started doing it and I started using it. So I felt it was weird, double-edged sword. Like I felt, hey, this is really cool because bad guys are using it. I feel like validated, but at the same time, I'm like, well, crap, bad guys are using this thing, right?
Yeah,
Awesome.
and yeah, you just need a different title next time. Like, this gets you a bunch of access quickly. One step to domain admin.
Yeah.
See, that's the problem. You thought too hard about a title, and that's where you threw everybody off.
I had the title way early. I didn't have a cool logo that may have helped. But the nice thing with this attack from an attacker's perspective, getting back to the technical piece, any user can do this, right? We mentioned this, the domain controller doesn't decide. Any lowly user can do this. I mentioned sort of like the Steve in accounting. He's not going to have admin access, not even probably going to have access through firewalls to access database servers, but you can still request the ticket, still perform these kind of attacks. So it does give you a lot of deep reach into the organization to some very powerful accounts.
And I'm going to do the Bryson this time. So on the blue team side here, right? So there's some mitigations for this, like managed service accounts and things like that. In the real world, we've seen, services to manage the passwords related to this, right? So really, really strong passwords that are, going to be a pain to crack because these hashes don't crack quickly. We've seen people write detections around this, right? So requesting these tickets from like workstation subnets where it's uncommon, the threshold account. So a lot of places will do threshold detections. Will just say, hey, if more than one of these is requested within 24 hours from this machine, it puts some alerting there. So there's some good stuff in the detection space for this, and then the mitigations, right? So companies spend a lot of time trying to fix this. I think what I've seen is really, really strong randomized passwords if they can push that out. Obviously, getting rid of these and using some of the other options are valid routes as well, but kind of depends on your business. George, you've seen stuff on the detection side?
To jump on that, sorry. I thought this was going to die way sooner. I'm like, cool, flash in the pan. But we literally did it last week. Like, all you got to do is pick a good password, right? Like, it's literally that simple. There's better ways to do it, sure. There's plenty of detections. Just pick a good bloody password. And it's sort of disheartening. Like, look, it's a service account. No one types this thing in, but you still can't change the password from 2004. Another great, to your point, Justin, detection is some honey tokens, some honey SPNs that are out there. Like, nobody should be requesting a ticket for this service. If anybody does, you got your detection. And we need to look at detection, not just prevention. We love prevention, but that's at best half of the story because things are going to go sideways. We are going to miss something. We need to do some detection. So George, go ahead. Sorry.
On the actually fixing this side, I had the experience working at a large organization that has been around for a couple hundred years. And it was very hard to fix because all those service accounts didn't have owners when they were created. They also had very, very weak passwords, like you said. So yeah, one, find the owner. That person left forever ago. Two, who is going to have the willpower to go ahead and change that password and cross your fingers and hope you don't crash a whole bunch of transactions moving across the world right now, right? And it wasn't just one account, right? There were like thousands of these accounts and no owner, no one with the ambition to try and take that risk of changing it, and heaven forbid you broke something. And so it was a very uphill battle that started once around 2016, and it took a good 4 years to get to the point where all those service accounts had at least 25 character password. And we had a lot of fight back for that too, because like, why 25 characters? Like, it's a service account. It's pseudo random. You copy and paste it once. That's it. You don't need it to be less than that. But yeah, it took a lot of work to go through those. And then of course, after you do those service accounts, you start looking at Active Directory and doing password audits and stuff like that. You got 200,000 people working in your org, and about the same amount of service accounts. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, it's not easy.
Okay.
Go for it.
Oh, I was just saying, another piece I found interesting here is they had two methods here. Like, it was a choose your own adventure to some degree. Justin hit on it before. The PowerShell, we've seen a lot of instrumentation, tooling, alerting around PowerShell. So there's a second approach here where you can use the execute assembly. So we're going to load essentially the code directly into memory and execute it. It's not PowerShell. It's not going to get the same type of logging. So I thought that was an interesting spin here. Like, hey, if this doesn't work, try this other thing, right? Because even if it does detect, trigger an alert rather, they have to respond quickly enough in order to stop this thing, right? Like, you can send alerts all day. I hate to pick on Target still, but Target had quite literally hundreds of thousands of alerts, and they didn't respond. They missed them. They were actually squelched in their SIM. So, from an offensive perspective, one of the big differences we see with these ransomware actors is the speed at which they do some of their stuff, right? They get in, and it can be a few days, and they just start wreaking havoc, right? They don't need the persistence necessarily. They just like, hey, we're in good enough, hit the button, or some defender like, hey, we see defender poking around, hit the button, let's start cryptoing everything.
Sweet. So just looking at the time here, I don't think we're going to be able to go one by one. Mimikatz is the next one, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna skip that. I mean, obviously that's straightforward. Everybody's familiar with that. The time to pull in zero login and actually be using that, I mean, that was fairly short. I mean, that's probably the main point from that section. I wanted to touch on 5 here. The group policy, the passwords and group policy preferences. Since this was a issue from 2014, I believe, 2014 or 2015, where you could, the Microsoft published the decryption key so you could pull the passwords back out. But like Tim had mentioned before, his Kerberos talk was fairly old, and if this step is in here, obviously this is still out here in some capacity. And I know I've seen it in the wild before in recent years, but it's an interesting one to still see around.
Yeah, that one definitely got my attention. The other one that's still on here is MS-17010, the Eternal Blue, still being on there. But on the other side, like Print Nightmare's on here too. So like these obviously work. They test the various different things, and it's not how sophisticated the attacker is. It's just what works.
Exactly, and I think the biggest what works is the number 6, right? The passwords. We see time and time again from an offensive perspective, season and year is the gift that absolutely keeps on giving. Right? 90 days rotation policy. Somebody can look out the window, remember their password, the season, and then you put the year on the end to get the digits, increment the season and year, and it just continues to give. I guess more interesting and frankly a little bit surprising were the passwords right above that. Like, the other passwords to try are password 1, hello 123, banco at 1. Like, what the heck is banco at 1? It's clearly on this list because it has worked many times for them.
It's a
right?
bank. That's the word for bank in Spanish.
There you go.
Yeah, but the fact that this 7-character password is in that list, the word training all lowercase. I mean, they are doing, because what they're getting large organizations, they get these passwords, they're essentially giving us a worldwide password audit, and here are the crappiest ones that they see, right? This is exactly the data that we're getting here, and it's terrifying to see passwords that are that absolutely craptastic. They're even worse than the season and year. They're it's crazy.
The funniest thing to me here, and you'll probably get this from pen testers, is they're pulling the lockout policy and the password stuff, right? So you'll see this a lot with pen testing where places will want to brute force accounts, but one of the things they'll run into is observation window and lockout policies. and it's entertaining to me because you'll see a lot of new pen testers forget to have this conversation or forget to check, and then before they go to town, they're locking out a bunch of random accounts. And it's interesting in here to see that they actually stop, check those values and then continue based on that, which was, for me, that was interesting because I know that even some seasoned pen testers run into that, doing credential spraying on the outside or something like that, forgetting that maybe the observation window is very long or the lockout threshold is very low.
And what's interesting though too is, to that point, they're taking kind of a crap look at it to some degree because you've got fine grained password policies. I mean, maybe what we're learning from this is they don't care. Like the vast majority of organizations aren't using this, so the default one is good enough.
Yeah, so as we get through these, right, the whole one, then if you haven't read the manual and you're just listening here, stage 2 is exfiltrating data, and stage 3 is the encryption. But if we just look at stage 1, right, everything up to now has been Cobalt Strike. My question, and what Justin posted on Twitter that I feel I know the answer to, is can you only do this on Cobalt Strike, or can you do this on any of the other 79 C2s on the C2 matrix?
Yeah, so I mean, the vast majority of this, right, is so generic that you could do this with other frameworks. You could do this with Metasploit. You could do it with the other ones. I mean, you're essentially, the stage you're at now. The battle you went through was, how can I get some code to execute in memory? Once your implant's running, is something going to trip PowerShell? Is something going to trip some other detection, or something going to trip like their AV? But if you look at the manual and the rest of the tools that they have, they had a lot of steps to disable Defender, disable Sophos. So you're kind of acting in an environment where there's no detection space. So I think it really, shows you that you can use just about anything to get down, this workflow that they have. There was some stuff farther down with using BOF files, which, don't really apply to some other frameworks, but, by and large, I think this is interchangeable.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest benefits we get with Cobalt Strike, I mean, it's a fantastic tool set, but the reason that I love it is it just works, right? Like, so many other frameworks are like, well, I just lost my session, or beacon, or grunt, whatever the hell you want to call it. They're like, why? I don't know. And it's much more robust, so I think that's why people continue to use that.
Yeah. I remember coming from a time where Cobalt Strike didn't exist, and we used Metasploit, and you'd end up in a situation where you're using Metasploit all day on a pen test, and all of a sudden your interpreter shell is just dead, right? Like, you didn't have that with Cobalt Strike. I think when Raf built Cobalt mostly by himself, his biggest thing was stability. So I know switching that around has been a godsend, and now there's, at least for testing that way, but some of the other frameworks we've tested in the past, are stability is much better than it used to be. But I do agree that by and large, it has the you don't run into the bugs where the implant itself crashes, compared to others.
Yeah, that's why the C2 matrix started, actually. I don't know if you know that story. So I finished writing my 2-day course with Empire, because back in 2019, that was the most reliable and consistent C2, which is what you need in a classroom, right? So it was ideal for a classroom setting because you type something and it runs, and it's not crashing and all that. And then those folks are like, all right, we're done with this. And I'm like, all right, what do you use? And I remember asking Tim, he's like Merlin, and then Jeff McJunkin is like Sliver, and then someone's like this. I'm like, whoa. Let's see what each of these can do. And then the list kind of grew a little bit. But yeah, I definitely think most of these you can do with any. I think that, the BOF stuff, the execute assembly, some have execute assembly, some don't. But I mean, at this point, you could probably drop these binaries onto disk. You can drop these PowerShell scripts onto disk, and you're not worried about detection. And then the exfiltration stuff, all rclone. And I actually hadn't seen rclone until I was looking at one of these ransomware groups, and I don't know if you all are familiar with it. Essentially, it's this little free app that lets you connect to like 80 different cloud providers. So it's a little configuration file. You give it your API key, your credentials, and then you tell it what you want to sync with the cloud, right? Like it's literally just using, and it does AWS, it does GCP, it does, right? It's not just Mega. Mega is one of the cloud providers. But I started looking into it, and I'm like, well, rclone is actually pretty convenient because you can actually just drop the rclone.exe and the rclone configuration file and tell it to clone everything to the cloud, right? And if organizations aren't, are allowing cloud access, then there goes your data. But yeah, that definitely the exfiltration stuff was, different. I think most of us, when we do exfil, or I'll put it up to you, Justin, Tim, like when you exfil stuff to prove you can exfil, how are you doing that? Are you doing that through the same C2 channel? Or are you doing other protocols? Are you doing cloud services?
So in my case, we try to use the cloud services that the client themselves uses. So whatever they use for large file transfer, that would be the preferred route to go, right? So it depends on the maturity and their level of detection, but we always try to use whatever they're going to be doing the largest file transfer over, just because it tends to blend in better.
Yep.
Yeah, we do. I mean, it depends on the engagement too. So like if we're trying to stay on the redder end, if you will, we pick one that we think, like, hey, look, we see OneDrive, let's use that, right? And I think Justin probably too would probably agree. We don't, in our case, I don't want the real client data, because then I'm covered in their data, right? And I don't want that, because now I have to control it, and now I become part of someone's CDE. So we many times will create data that looks very similar to it. I know SCYTHE, the modules that you guys have with SCYTHE that do some of the ransomware emulation, do the same sorts of thing, and we just try to send out a whole bunch of data. Now we've got other sort of assessments, we call it like a C2 and egress, where we'll try like, hey, we'll try to exfil over SSH or HTTP or FTP, what ports are allowed out, and see what's caught and what's not, and make recommendations to tighten things up and make some modifications there. So yeah, I mean, the exfil thing, we see that time and time again, where there's just way too much out. People are preventing attackers from getting in, but once they're in, they got everything and they can run out like crazy.
Yep, and we posted up the rclone overview just so you can see. But yeah, it's exactly that, figuring out what they allow outbound and use that. I think we spoke about that with the other Tim in the past episode. And then it is ransomware. So the last section here of this manual talks a lot about disabling antivirus and then actually dropping the ransomware itself, which does the encryption and the ransom key and all that fun stuff that we tend to hear. But really up to this point, a lot of the same things that we've done for years in pen tests, in red team engagements. The only difference with ransomware is those final steps, that impact part.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically looping through either, classic sysinternals PSExec, or using WMIC to kind of go through and then drop and execute, an exe on all of these systems out of app data. So this is, I mean, if it gets to this point, I guess you're kind of at a point of no return if they have, domain admin and kind of touch all these systems, right? So, as an organization, you need to be able to administer machines, but you need to pick and choose what protocols work. So there's probably some area here where you could build some defenses around this, but again, like if they've got this far, then you're probably not in a position where you can stop this.
Yeah, that's a good point, because even if you at this point detect it, you're going to lose that race, right? Unless you pull the plug to the internet, you will not. You can't catch up. You've got too big of a head start, right? But I like what's interesting is they've been using the same techniques for quite literally decades, right? PSExec's been around for bloody ever. That's been part of incident response toolkit, is to look for that. You can literally map how people move through the organization, how the bad guys move through the organization by when the service was installed. It's not necessarily new, right? And if you look at, like, for example, the AV disabling, like you mentioned, Justin, the first option is go through the GUI. It's not high tech, it's not advanced. It's like, hey, we're just logged into this system with like RDP, and let's turn this thing off. It just dead freaking simple kind of stuff.
One of the things buried in here, so after obviously the PSXX ones, but there's a VM killer for ESXi, right? You're starting to see these groups target, the server infrastructure, shutting down the machines or encrypting the actual virtual machines, trying to find ways to cause more impact, right? You might be able to re-image all of your workstations in short order, where you start running into losing all of your VMs and things is kind of ratcheting up the end cost for you. And that was interesting to see in here where they have, specifically like list VMs and -- VM killer in this Linux script.
Yeah, and the other thing that popped up at me, I'm trying to scroll for it, was the Autodesk stuff, right? These leveraging agents that are already there that allow you to manage a bunch of things, right, when it's not AD, and then using that. And that's exactly what we saw with Rievo and Kaseya, right? They took advantage of an agent that already had system level privileges and really got to skip all these steps and get straight to system on a whole bunch of systems and deploy what you wanted to deploy. I don't even think that Rievo one, the Kaseya one at least, exfiltrated data. I think that they only did the disabling of AV and the ransoming of files.
I think one of the other interesting pieces that I didn't quite expect was how they're looking for the data to pull. So they're pulling, bank statements, client information. But one of the things they have written in here is insurance and underwriting. There's multiple pieces here, which I think, I think that signals to me to some degree that they're looking at the insurance policy, seeing how much they're going to pay out, and they're like, cool, your insurance pays $5 million? Gotcha, I got a deal. 4.9 million. Right? Because at that point, they're like, cool, pay it, we'll try to get the money back. That's a whole separate discussion on cyber insurance. But they're clearly targeting this, exposing their cyber insurance online. Like, who cares, right? If you steal my life insurance policy and publish it online, I'm not going to give you a nickel. In fact, maybe it's easier for me to find it when I, can't find the files. The only reason I can think of why they would publish this is for their own self-interest to quite literally price the cost of the ransom.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. I don't fully understand how insurance works these days because, I work with people who do IR. I have a lot of friends in IR, and the number of times insurance pays this out, not to change it to that whole topic, but it's very interesting that they just have to be bleeding money on the insurance side. And obviously it's easier for these guys going in knowing, hey, the cyber insurance will pay out X versus, we're going to have to really lean on these people to pay is makes their business a little bit easier.
Yeah, and one thing we talked about is why not hack the insurance company themselves, find out all of the customers they have, all of the policy, that way they know the numbers, and they just start going one by one, bam, bam, bam. They know how much they're going to get paid. Their ROI can be calculated prior to even getting into them. And there they go. But of course, I don't want to give any bad ideas here. Please do everything for good, be ethical. Thank you.
Well, but to some degree, because they're oversubscribed, right? If everybody had a claim for their max, they'd be out of business 100 times over. So I think you could do that, but maybe cherry pick a few or slow play it. Because you got to keep them alive, right? If the vampire comes in and drinks all the blood, that thing's dead. But if you can slow play it and let it, get a little blood back, you can do this for.
So
eternity.
How about you do a few and then you go on vacation for 2 months and then you come back as a different name and then oh shit, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, somewhere
that wasn't my
idea.
idea.
there's like a sed command in here somewhere to change Conti to something else.
Yeah, exactly.
The best, so we kept equating this to pen testing, right? So the literal last line in this thing is preparing of report. So we were talking about how this, bring this back around, how it runs like a business. They're in there writing a report about what they just did, what they took, revenue of the company, all that information, like what ransomware they deployed, things like that. So it's very, very similar to that legitimate industry.
They use Zoom Info like every other sales org.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are right around time. Any closing thoughts, Mr. Tim? We'll start with you.
No, it's I like to talk about this other side to some degree because it helps us as offensive people better play the attacker and better understand the risk to some organizations because they want us to do, testing, whatever that might mean. And we're supposed to demonstrate that risk, and we can say, look, this is the crap the bad guys are like, oh, well, that's not very advanced. Yeah, because look, some of these commands that the bad guys are doing, they've been doing for a decade. Why do I need to break out O-Day if these simple, basic commands are working in your environment, right? So I think this exposure really helps us tune our playbooks so that we can best represent, the real world actors out there and not have to dig into, somebody else's analysis of it. It's quite literally their playbook, and we can go through and almost copy and paste some of this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think this is a great example of something that, you say like individual companies should dig into this, right? And that's tough because if this is working on you, then not necessarily, you might not be the best at security, or you might be in, going down the path and trying to build these things. But I would love to see all the MSSPs out there, digest this document and build as many detections off of this specifically, because I feel like you'll get the biggest impact. The same thing with like the Defender team. Any areas in here where they can build, I know they've been branching out into kind of like behavioral around like command line switches and stuff like that. But I feel like people should use this as a model because this is what you're fighting at scale. It's not, like you said, it's not the people dropping 0-day. It's not, off the wall attacks. It's these steps in this order. And if you can build detections around it, you can, if you're an MSSP, you can give a lot of value to your client base right away.
Yeah, all about detecting and responding. I mean, obviously that initial access is there. Lots of organizations are keep focusing on that. I mean, another thing I love about Tim Medin was his push for assumed breach, and another great talk. But yeah, exactly. We need to get to the point where it's all about detecting and responding to this, and as early as possible. And this definitely has lots of, where should I get started? I'm brand new to these. Start on step one and work your way through building detections and learning how to do it, right? I'm a big fan of purple teaming, so had to throw that in there. But yeah, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining another episode. And thank you to you, Tim, and to co-host Justin, and a virtual hug to Bryson, who's probably out on the beach somewhere where Tim will be for the rest of the weekend.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going back down there very shortly with a fruity drink. And
nice. Can't wait for your tweets later on.
Nice.
All right, all. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you.